Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Sergeant Myron Cozier of San Diego, California, was shot in the throat in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese bullet severed his infected tonsils and left him otherwise unharmed and much relieved. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a funny election. A cigar store Indian was elected Justice of the Peace in Allentown, New Jersey in 1883. The statue, clothed with the fictitious name of Abner Robbins, was duly placed on the ballot and elected by a margin of 7 votes over the incumbent Sam Davis. Judge Davis, who'd held the office for many years, resigned in a huff when he learned that his successful opponent was a wooden Indian. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
In World War II, at the Battle of Mokmir Airdrome on Biak Island, 2 artillery shells, one American and the other Japanese, fused together by a head-on impact in flight. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an act of courage. Yuan Chang, a minister in the Chinese Foreign Office in 1900, stopped a plan to slaughter thousands of foreigners by changing one word of a telegram. Yuan substituted the word Pao, protect, for the word Sha, kill, in a message sent by the Empress of China. The courageous foreign minister was himself beheaded for his act of courage. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Count Nesselrode was foreign minister of Russia for 40 years, yet he never learned to speak Russian. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a floating Christmas present. In December 1940, Mrs. A.E. Gadsby of Niagara Falls, Canada, mailed a Christmas parcel to her daughter in Prestwick, Scotland. The ship carrying the mails was torpedoed off the west coast of Ireland, but a favorable tide floated the package and unerringly cast it ashore on the beach of Prestwick. The contents were soaked, but perfectly usable. The address was still legible, and the package was delivered 2 days after Christmas. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The faithful believe that Muhammad ibn Daud, a dead Persian sultan, will be resurrected, and a saddled horse has been held in readiness before his tomb in Khorasan since 1072. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a fish story. The fishermen of the seaport of St. Malo, France, never retain the first catch of the season. As soon as they pull the first fish out of the water, they pour half a bottle of wine down its throat and toss it back into the sea. They believe that all the other fish will crowd around the returnee, and getting a whiff of the wine, will rush to the surface begging to be caught. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
A 5-man bowling team sponsored by Roger Schmitz in a league tournament scored 187, 188, 189, 190, and 191. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a very choosy thief. Jean Poqueton of Haute-Vière, France, sentenced to death as a habitual thief, was told that he would be released if a pure maiden were willing to marry him. A homely orphan girl stepped forward willingly, but Poqueton took one look at her and said, "No, I'd rather marry the gallows. Hangman, do your duty." He was hanged forthwith. in the city of Reims in 1234. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
O'Rourke's Ford in County Sligo, Erie, is never crossed by any man named O'Rourke. An ancient curse against a pagan prince named O'Rourke is never defied. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a very strange president. President Ignacio Comonfort of Mexico headed a rebellion against himself. The distinguished soldier and politician became president of Mexico in December 1855. 2 years later, December 19th, 1857, he became an active rebel against himself and effected his own overthrow and exile, February 5th, 1858. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Larry Lingle, age 17 months, of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, swallowed a nickel and coughed up a penny. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange death. In 1893, Henry Zigland jilted his sweetheart, who then killed herself. Her brother tried to avenge her by shooting Zigland, but the bullet only grazed his face and buried itself in a tree. The brother, thinking he'd killed Zigland, committed suicide. 20 years later, Zigland was cutting down the tree with a bullet in it. It was a tough job, so he used dynamite, and the explosion sent the old bullet through his head, killing him. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
John Motley, English dramatist, was the author of Joe Miller's joke book. Joe Miller, a gloomy actor, could not read or write and never uttered a joke in his life. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an unusual temple. The so-called Snake Pagoda in Arakan, Burma, is a striking 45-foot-high structure which has the outside shape of a great coiled snake. The interior is fully furnished as a Buddhist house of prayer. People bitten by poisonous snakes are rushed here, often from great distances, to pray for a miraculous salvation from death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Golden Pagoda in Bangkok, Siam, was erected by King Chulalongkorn at a cost of $500,000 for his 10-year-old son, and never used again. Believe it or not. You about an unusual purchase. Thomas Handford of New Mills, Lancashire, England, was a reformed drunkard and poacher who served many a term in the town jail. After 10 years of total from drink and petty crime, he saved enough money to purchase his former prison and live in it the remainder of his life, all by himself. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Officers in the Turkish Navy once were required to wear wooden replicas of their warships on their hats. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you an odd way to live to a ripe old age. Sir John Robertson, 5 times Prime Minister of New South Wales, Australia, had a peculiar, but for him, successful way to enjoy a good long life. Every morning for 35 years, Sir John bought 3 pints of rum. This shopping tour was invariably accomplished on horseback. The Premier consumed 1 pint of rum on the spot, gave another pint to his riding boots, as a preventive against rheumatism. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
For 500 years, Japanese emperors signed every document with the imprint of a palm dipped in human blood, a signature that could never be eradicated. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange death wish. He had 13,140 wives and 2,800 children. He lived in a palace of 10,000 rooms, and for a period of 27 years never slept in the same room twice. This was Qin Shi Huang Tai, the first Chinese emperor. He built the Great Wall of China, and to make it strong, he buried more than 1 million coolies in its walls. This strange emperor ordered his entire family buried alive with him at his death. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The largest clan in Scotland isn't MacDonald. It isn't Campbell either. According to statistics compiled by the Scottish Post Office, the largest clan in Scotland is Smith. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about the clock that was repaired by a child. After ticking off time for 195 years, the clock in the tower of the Church of Penn stopped in 1910. For the next 15 years, Europe's finest clockmakers tried in vain to get the clock to run. Then one more person asked permission to try. Patricia Cuthbert succeeded where master clockmakers had failed. The clock has been running ever since, repaired by a 13-year-old girl. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
One of the cleverest hunters in nature is the yellow-winged sparrow. When he goes after a grasshopper, he lures it into the open by doing a perfect imitation of the grasshopper's chirp. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a church disaster. It happened February 23rd, 1887, in Bussana Vecchia, Italy. On that day, a furious earthquake rumbled through the town, split open and crumbled the parish church where a service was in progress. The ear-shattering quake completely razed the church, caused the deaths of every single member of the congregation, some 300. Yet the clergyman presiding at the service escaped completely unharmed. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Frances Isabella, wife of the 4th Marquis of Bath, insisted all members of the household wash their money every day. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about an astonishing builder of roads. One wonders whether the people of Ceylon pay honor to a certain foreigner, a foreigner named Skinner. Skinner was a road builder and engineer who literally carved Ceylon out of the darkness of jungles and swamps with some 3,000 miles of highways built over a period of 50 years. As awesome as these tasks must have been, the most tremendous feat in his career was an 11-mile stretch of road built when he was just 16 years old. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The Duke of Wharton was a member of the Irish House of Lords for 3 years before he was old enough to vote in a parliamentary election. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man who overcame a fantastic physical handicap. Men have overcome enormous physical handicaps. They're true stories of blind mountain climbers, deaf acoustical engineers, And there was Hermann Unten, a native of Prussia, who became a world-famous violinist in the 20th century. Unten's physical handicap was that he had no arms, yet he mastered the violin and thrilled audiences by playing the instrument with his feet. He could even wind his own watch. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Broker's Tip, a racehorse owned by Colonel E.R. Bradley, won only one race in his entire life. But that race was the Kentucky Derby. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell a story about how nature played a cruel trick on man. Among the rocky hazards to sailors and ships in the 17th century were the Scilly Islands of England. In order to keep ships away from the treacherous rocks of Scilly, the lighthouse of St. Agnes was built. In those days, of course, the source of light came from a fire, and, ironically, the very first boat to carry the fuel to light the fire in the newly erected lighthouse never reached her destination. She smashed into it in the dark and was wrecked. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Dick Allen of Happy, Texas, born without ears or ear openings, could hear distinctly through his mouth and became an excellent musician. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you a story about a baby who commanded an army. Duke Godivart Godfrey III of Brabant, Belgium, succeeded his father as sovereign when he was only 3 months old. As soon as he was on the throne, war broke out, and it became the baby's duty to lead the army into battle. He was placed in a cradle in charge of a nurse who strapped him between 2 trees right on the battlefield. The battle was won, and the infant was credited with the victory. A commander-in-chief in diapers. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Among the stranger memorials left on Earth is a chief's grave in the Banza Sangabando tribe, marked by all the gin bottles he emptied in his lifetime. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a potentate who lived 2 lives. The Raja of Kolampur certainly led a double life. By day, he ruled an Indian state with a population of over 1 million people. But when it grew dark, the Raja disguised himself as a robber. Then, leading a band of thieves, the Raja plundered and robbed not only the subjects of his own kingdom, but his own treasury as well. He was even so bold as to offer a reward for the capture of this gang, the gang he led himself. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
One great quirk in marine biology is the porpoise. They have as many as 96 teeth, yet they swallow their food whole. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a queen who was one of history's great killjoys. Theater-goers and playwrights alike had a long, long wait between seasons during part of the reign of Queen Marie Anne of Spain. Because she considered her son, the 4-year-old King Charles II, too young to understand such things as theatrical drama, the Queen closed every theater in the country. Her reason was simple. If the King of Spain couldn't go to the theater, then the King's subjects shouldn't go to the theater either. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Ludwig Purtscheller, a gym teacher from Salzburg, Austria, climbed 7 mountains, each over 9,000 feet, on a single day. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a misplaced building. America's great historic debates and the passage of laws almost didn't happen in Washington, D.C., for the national capital was originally planned to be located in Alexandria, Virginia, not the District of Columbia. The original site is now the location of the George Washington Masonic Memorial Temple, a 400-foot-high temple that cost $5 million, paid for by no fewer than 3,200,000 contributions. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Charles Galpin served Minnetonka, Minnesota as preacher, teacher, shipbuilder, tinsmith, surveyor, mailman, and dentist. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a man of extraordinary talent. News didn't travel very fast in 1776, and there's no question the creation of the United States was going to be the news story of the century. What a potentially complicated story it was, too. A new nation, a new kind of government. How wise it was, then, that the Continental Congress engaged one Reverend Peter Johann Miller, who translated the Declaration of Independence into Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and Russian. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Wealthy natives in Angola, Africa, are buried beneath their luggage, so they'll have their possessions for life in the next world. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a dream that came true. Do dreams ever really come true? Or are they merely a form of wishful thinking? For John Helder, a farmer from Soham, England, a dream was something more than mere fantasy. It was rooted in fact. So when Helder dreamed of falling in love with a girl he saw in his dream, he began to search for that girl from house to house for months, until finally he actually found her. The girl from his dream became his happily married wife for 40 years. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
King Henry II of England, in a campaign to wipe out robber barons, destroyed 1,115 castles. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a gruesome wedding ceremony. If the wedding announcement appeared in the local newspapers, there's no question it would be the news story of the day. For Elizabeth Kelsey and Jonathan Titus were married in a graveyard. It seems the day before this Salisbury, Vermont couple were to be wed, the bride's brother died. It was decided, however, that the late brother would attend the wedding anyway. So the couple exchanged their wedding vows beside his open grave. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Sultan Murad IV of Turkey hurled a 4-foot palm staff a distance of over 1,300 feet while riding his horse. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a place where a criminal could remain free. In the movies, the criminal being chased very often finds his sanctuary in a conveniently located church. But in ancient China, a place to find sanctuary was a matter of fact. It was called the Sanctuary of Chungking, and every criminal who climbed this rock ahead of his pursuers was assured safe refuge, just as long as he stayed inside the pagoda, which was some 120 feet high. Actually, a prisoner of his own freedom. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction, and this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
The purest well water in the world comes from St. Anne's Well in Malvern, England. The water is 99.99992% pure. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a church with hidden treasure. Somewhere in Batz, France, a treasure of gold lies buried near the church of San Guineau. Unfortunately, there's not even the crudest treasure map to follow. Only the dying words of the builder, who said he buried the treasure in a spot touched by the shadow of the church tower. Today, more than 400 years later, the treasure remains unfound. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Manlius Aquilius, Roman governor of Sicily, was punished for his greed by being forced to swallow 10 pounds of molten gold. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a king with a one-track mind. The temple built by King Lai Tai Ton in Hanoi in 1049 was created because of a strange and moving dream. In the dream, King Lai saw the vision of a one-legged goddess, and it so affected him that he had one of his own legs amputated, married a one-legged queen, established a court populated by one-legged courtesans, and built a temple that rises on only one leg. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Count Julius Litta of Russia was so fond of ice cream that he ate 5 pints at dinner every day for 49 years. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a strange fashion in women's hats. Fashion may be fickle in most parts of the world, but in Oléron, France, fashions, at least in women's hats, haven't changed for centuries. For today, the so-called chaperon chapeau women of the town wear huge hats, designed originally in 1339 to discourage romantic attentions of English soldiers. The hat is called a cuissino, a French adaptation of the expression, kiss me not. Believe it or not.
Truth is stranger than fiction. And this is the proof. This is Ripleys. Believe it or not.
Geoffrey Hudson served as a captain of cavalry in the British Army on combat duty. Yet, he was only 18 inches tall. Believe it or not. In a moment, I'll tell you about a church built because of spilled ink. Perhaps it was one of the earliest ink blot tests, but the results are startling indeed. For in Buhl, France, 2 identical churches were constructed side by side. It seems a resident of the town, in his will, ordered that his estate be used to build a church. But there was a splatter of ink on his will, and this was interpreted as a request for not one church to be built, but 2. Believe it or not.